Welcome back to Be the Change podcast. We have our special guest back again, Jeremy Bennett. Jeremy's going to get into a little bit of conversation about how we calm our mind, our mindset, and all those fascinating things.
Great to be back. That's a question I'm asked a lot. How do you calm the mind? And once
Mhm.
again, I've had that journey with OCD and anxiety. By no stretch of the imagination am I an expert on this, but I'll share some things that worked for me. And one of the biggest epiphanies I've ever had, and certainly I didn't discover this, but one of the biggest things that changed my mindset about mindset was this one thing is that there's certain parts of our brain that have a very difficult time telling the difference between something real and a thought. And it's like, if you were scared of spiders and you legitimately physically held onto a spider, what's going to happen? Your heart is going to beat a little faster.
Mhm.
You're probably going to sweat. You're probably going to tremble. You're probably going to become tense. You're going to go into what's called that fight or flight response, which is not a bad thing. The fight or flight is not a bad response. We should, for the most part, there's always exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, the fight or flight response typically should happen when you're in some kind of danger. But most of the time, we're not in danger when we experience the fight or flight response. So why does that happen? And when I realized this, it was a game changer for me. It truly, legitimately was. So the reality is certain parts of our brain have a difficult time telling the difference between something real and a thought. So if you physically held a spider, you're going to get the fight or flight response. Most people would. But if you thought about holding onto a spider and you were scared of spiders, your heart would probably race a little faster. You probably sweat, depending upon, how scared of spiders you were. You probably enter the fight or flight response if it was a very real, very vivid thought, because the brain is saying, your wish is my command. What's in your mind, I'm going to react to. Or if you think about a person you don't like, they don't have to be in front of you. You're probably going to feel tense. So the reality is, the average person has thousands and thousands of thoughts every day, and it wouldn't be bad if they were good thoughts. But the reality is most of the thoughts are bad thoughts, either dwelling on something in the past or fearing something that could potentially happen tomorrow. And the brain kind of says, your wish is my command. What you think about, I'm going to make you react to. Um, and when we finally realize that the mind has that much power, thousands of thoughts every single day, most of them are bad, when we realize how important mindset is, we can start to address it. And not only are most of those thoughts bad thoughts, dwelling on the past or fearing the future, most of those thoughts are recycled thoughts, thoughts that we had the day before and the day before and the day before and the day before. So, and not only that, when we have these repetitive thoughts, we have something in our brain called the reticular activating system that kind of makes our eyes pay attention to more of that energy. It's kind of like when you buy a new car, you start to see that car everywhere. It's not that we start to see it, we start to notice it because we saw all those cars the week before we bought that particular car. Why didn't we notice them? Because we didn't own it. The second we own it, it becomes one word, relevant. When that car becomes relevant, the reticular activating system trains our eyes to pay attention to things that are relevant. So if you had an interest in sports, say baseball, and I didn't, and we were going up the same exact street, and there was a baseball field to our left, you would probably take notice of it. And I would see it, but I probably wouldn't take notice of it. And, it depends upon what we're interested in. If we're into a shopping mall and there's thousands of people and thousands of conversations and it's just a mumble, you can't understand anybody. But the second somebody says, Jeremy, I'm going to dial in on that conversation because why? The word Jeremy is relevant to me. So we typically pay attention to what is relevant to us. So when we realize that the thoughts we think actually can have a physiological impact on the body, then we can kind of start addressing, well, what are we thinking about? What are we paying attention to? What are we watching on TV? What are we listening to? Who are we hanging around? And, life starts to make a little more sense. And one of the best techniques I think that really helped me, everybody in the world is different, but really helped me was to start catching our negative thoughts. Because when we start to catch ourselves thinking negative thoughts, a couple of things will happen. Number one, you can't think when you just caught yourself thinking. So when you catch yourself thinking, you're automatically in the present moment. You're meditating. And meditation, I know you know this, but meditation is simply when you stop thinking. And when you stop thinking, you're grounded, you're present, you're awake, you're aware, you're in the present moment. And what that is essentially doing, you're giving your mind the rest that it desperately needs. Because a lot of people think we should be thinking all day long, like 24/7, when we shouldn't. And I give this analogy in my presentation. It's kind of like going to a gym and your trainer's there, and the trainer says, I want you to lift that 20-pound barbell over your head 50 times. And most people will be like, well, I can't do that. But what if that trainer said, oh, I forgot to tell you, you can take as many breaks as you want. You can take a break every 2 seconds if you want. You can do 1 rep per day if you want. Then it becomes a little more doable. So the mind works in the same way. We shouldn't always be using the mind. We need to be relatively present sometimes to give the mind a break. Because when you give the mind a break, it seems like kind of life slows down. Like we have more energy, because when we're constantly thinking negative thoughts, we could be contributing to the fight or flight response when we don't necessarily need it. Sometimes that's great. Fight or flight is great, keeps us alive. But when we catch our negative thoughts, it might only last for 2 or 3 seconds. But the reality is, when we catch our negative thoughts, we give our mind a break. And 5 seconds later, the mind could literally be, thinking, catch it again and again and again and again and again, over and over and over and over and over again, to the point where those moments in between where the mind, is just overactive, they become smaller and smaller and smaller. And we become really good at catching our thoughts. I've been doing this for 20 years and I still get stuck in my head. Something's going on. I could be stuck in my head for 2 hours, literally 2 hours. And I'm like, Jeremy, like you didn't get any work done. You were just, dwelling on this or fearing this. And I mean, we're all human. We're not going to be in the present moment 24/7, and we shouldn't be. We got to think. We got to, and sometimes we got to think about bad things. Like that's how we learn. And fear is not a bad thing. But when it gets to the point where it's just kind of taking over, I think it's important to kind of rewind and say, why is this happening? Why am I thinking about this? And what impact is this happening? Is this having on our bodies and on our mind, and for that matter, the people around us, the people who hang around us, because we all know just by our presence, we affect the people around us, and vice versa. So it's kind of understanding how powerful the mind is to the point where we can actually, take very, very, very small baby steps, and with a little luck and a little persistence and consistency, probably start to calm our mind day by day.
Yeah, it's truly amazing how many negative thoughts we have. Like you said, it's just that. And I've tried that technique of kind of almost like putting it out and grabbing it like a net. It's just like, where'd that come from? Where did it just popped out of nowhere? It's just like, I wasn't even thinking about that. And all of a sudden it's just like, oh, that's kind of odd. Interesting to take notice of those times, and just, what it is that we do with it and how we kind of retrain ourselves to, put a positive thought there instead, and do more of a focus. It's kind of like we do 99 things in the one day, and that one thing that we do wrong, or we feel that was wrong, or maybe said in a way that we weren't happy with after the fact, that we harp on that one thing is just not the other 99 things that we did, fanatically well. So like we're, I guess, as human capacity of just, we tend to drone on with the negative as opposed to seeing the positivity of the day, and all those things that we influenced in a positive way, or the changes that we helped secure, or whatever that might look like. So this is of interest as a public speaker, when you're giving your story and you're having all those eyes on you, they've come to see you, they've come to hear what you have to say, to hopefully impact their lives, and all the things why we go to see people. Like when you go out on stage, like how do you, that fight or flight, a lot of us get that, the sweaty palms, just like, oh my goodness, like, can I do this? And, so when you start doing the public engagements, how did you do that initially, and to where you're to right now? Like, because I'm sure there's massive differences of, the comfortability and all those things as you settle in.
It's a really good question. What's funny is that at first, obviously terrified. But I mean, the
Mhm.
more I did it, the more I became immune to it. It's kind of like, very similar to, um, and not a lot of people know this, but when people came up to me and shared their story with me of OCD or anxiety, things that I could relate to, those moments were hard. Like it would take days and days and days to kind of shake that off and get back to myself because the stories were so incredibly emotional. I felt like I can't help these people in any way, shape, or form because I was a wreck, like hearing the stories. And
Mhm.
then eventually I became more comfortable with hearing those stories and the emails that would come in. But I mean, the more I looked at the stories, the more I read them, the more I heard about them, the more I was able to cope with it. And the same with speaking. The more I got around to speaking and shared my story on stage, the easier it became to the point where all the nervousness kind of just went away eventually from I think the most common fear is public speaking. I probably made that up, but I know it's one of the biggest, the most
It's up
popular
there.
fears. Yeah, and I had that on my show the other day. I was asking somebody about that, but I wasn't immune to that at first. It took many, 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 many attempts where I can remember doing I can't remember what it was called, but some kind of acupressure techniques where I was trying to calm down my body before I went on stage. And especially when, be even worse, when somebody was doing my intro and you're about to go on stage, like up until the intro where there's no turning back. Like, oh, like I can remember, there's one story I got to share. I've never shared this in my life, but I can remember I was on the road, I was doing a presentation, and I don't know. Somebody was giving me a tour of the place where I was presenting. And I don't know if it was motion sick while I was in the car or food poisoning. I don't know because I had I won't name the restaurant, but it was like a not a fast food, but very popular restaurant. Anyway, I was about to take the stage and I looked at the event coordinator and I was almost going to throw up. And it wasn't a fear, it was emotion sickness or food
Yeah.
poisoning, one or the other. And like I was about to go on stage and I'm like, I'm gonna throw up. I'm gonna throw up in front of like 400 people. And that fear just got the best of me. So right, like minutes beforehand, I looked at the event coordinator. I said, I think I got food poisoning. And I said, if I run off stage, you gotta come up, tell the audience I got food poisoning, I'm throwing up backstage, I'm not coming back out, and just tell them so they think I didn't, so they know what happened. But it was more and more of those situations that made me comfortable with how I was feeling and you know just being vulnerable. And one of the biggest things is sharing a story that's near and dear to you that you're comfortable with because then you're not trying to memorize lines. You're not trying.
Hmm.
I don't know how many times I share my OCD story, and I know a lot of the times it's I touch upon things that I didn't touch upon, in a previous presentation, and vice versa, is because whatever comes to me, whatever comes to my mind, whatever memories I get.
Hmm.
But another thing I wanted to mention, like it was just I became immune to it after a while, but the smaller meetings. If I had like a meeting at some kind of around a board table or something that was like 6 or 7 people, like 1,000 people in an audience, I'd be okay with. But if it was like a board meeting and I know, okay, it's your turn, and my turn is coming up, my heart would like I hated it still to this day because I'm not used to it. I'm not in that situation enough to build immunity to it. And it could be like 2 or 3 people in the room. And if it's a big meeting, 2 or 3 people in the room, I'm a frigging wreck. But a lot of people, they'd be like, 2 or 3 people in the room, get over it. And I'm like, well, I'm not used to it. It's not what I do every day. But I think to me, it was just getting up, being authentic, being vulnerable, and just doing it enough to the point where I became more comfortable with it.
So for you, it's interesting because you can talk in front of thousands or hundreds of people yet with small groups. So how does that work for you? I guess in business spaces, in you do podcasts, of course, is one-on-one, which is quite different as well. But you've had
Mhm.
some really fantastically amazing folks on your podcast that you've talked to that they're pretty well known throughout, Atlantic Canada and throughout Newfoundland and Labrador, of course. So like your take on that, I know that you're highlighting their stories, but you're part of their story.
Hmm. That's a really good question too. And like to me, and it was the podcast too. Like I tried to do a podcast years ago, like miserably failed. It was horrible. Just didn't know what I was doing, and and I did with the new one. Like I didn't know if that was going to do good at all. I didn't know if I'd make it past 5 episodes. I had no idea. But one thing that I'm so incredibly grateful that I did do was stay consistent. No matter how good or bad the show was doing, I just stayed consistent, episode every single day, paid my dues, and just kept on going. But like the first few episodes, I was stuttering. I was nervous. I was like, okay, what follow-up question do I ask? I think in my mind, I hope to God they don't, if they don't, they got a short answer, I'm done. I'm ruined. I don't have a clue what to ask them next. I'm going to stop recording. I'm going to have to edit this out. But I mean, the more, and I mean, you know this, you do this all the time. Like the more we do it, the more natural we become. And still to this day, I noticed that, in the podcast, as soon as we click record, like it's a brand new demeanor that comes over me and the podcast guest, and I like it's one of those things that I think it's called, what was it? I did psychology university, Hawthorne effect. When there's a camera on you, you react differently. Something I can't remember, something like that.
Yep.
And I think it's that. As soon as we click record, like everything is different. The lights are on, and then as soon as we stop recording, we just kind of relax and then we tell stories and that kind of thing. And I know you know this, you do this all the time. And it's, we're in that world where once, lights, camera, action, people are different. But it just, the more and more I did it, the more confident I became, the more natural I became. And, but coincidentally, the people who I know, like personally, on the podcast, those are the people who I'm the most nervous around. And I don't know why. It's just because I know them, I guess, complete strangers who I've never met before. It's a lot easier. I guess just the people I know, they know who I am personally. They know if I'm trying to act a little different, a little more professional, I'll probably mess that up in front of them and think, okay, they're going to think, But yeah, I think the more I did it, the easier it became, and the more comfortable I was.
So I guess a question I see a lot of people throwing out there to people is, what keeps you up at night? Like what is that at this point in your career?
Well, that's a really good question. Well, I tell you one thing, when like I got a little 3-year-old boy, so he physically kept my wife up a lot. There was, I'd say a stretch of about a year. He was waking up at 2:30 a.m. for the day, not to get up the feed. Well, he'd get up the feed, but 2:30 for the day. That was his time of getting up. So I'd get up, my wife would sleep, then we'd switch over, and then she'd go to work, I'd go to work. Our hours were completely messed up. But having a kid it's different. You have worries that you thought you'd never have before, different worries. You see life a little differently. And you always hear the cliche, like, well, I heard it so many times when people say they have kids, I can't watch emotional movies or movies about kids getting hurt or anything like that. And I'm thinking, years ago, it's just a movie. I can't do it. I can't do it now. Like you look at life so differently because, you're not living for yourself anymore. It's, but yeah, long story short, that definitely did. But I can relate to the whole physically not being able to sleep. And that was years ago, well before, we had a little boy in the mix, but I was that person who, when I was out doing the presentations, talking about, how to relax and that kind of thing, I can remember going to sleep or going to bed, I should say, at 11, 12 o'clock in the night, not getting to sleep until not that morning, not 3 o'clock that morning, 3 o'clock like the next morning, like going to meetings like this and stuttering and not being able to process what was being said. And I eventually, got to the point where I said, Jeremy, you got to get back to the basics. You got to get outside. You got to start eating good, because back then, even though I was in the gym like 6 nights a week, I was eating I was eating like low calorie food, but food that was horrible for me. Horrible for me. And the supplements I was taking, horrible. Wasn't like omega-3. And like it was just horrible, like
Mhm.
just not good for my body. And I started, it took that wake up call to really look at my life and say, you got to get back to the basics. You need sunlight, you need get out, you need to start drinking clean water, you need to socialize, because I really wasn't doing that. All the socialization was around business. And when I noticed when I was socializing around people who were in my life, people who I valued, things started to calm down and I could start to sleep a little better. And like I remember taking melatonin for years. And thank goodness I don't take it anymore. Nothing wrong. I don't have anything against melatonin, but I just had to take it to the point where I became immune to that. But thank goodness I got to a point where I could finally fall asleep at a decent hour, which is nowadays like 9:30. I go to bed and up, 5:30, 6 o'clock and working in the morning. But it takes time and it takes some lessons to smack us in the face and say, Jeremy, you gotta look at life differently now, and you gotta start living what you're preaching on stage.
Absolutely. So, if there's any closing thoughts, what would they be from you, for anyone listening?
Closing thoughts. Anything to do with stress or anxiety, reach out for help. It's one of the best decisions I've ever made. Like I said earlier, my work was never to really help people with severe OCD or anxiety. It was more so to help people who are relatively in good places in their lives, but with had a bit of anxiety with it. That's the people I helped, and I leave the more severe cases to the professionals. But to really understand mindset, I think is so incredibly important. We have so many thoughts a day, thousands, researchers say thousands, and most of them are bad thoughts, dwelling on the past or fearing the future. And the brain has a difficult time telling the difference between something real and a thought. So when we can understand that, we can start to look at our lives and say, okay, maybe this is why I'm feeling, this particular reason. There's a million different reasons why people feel the way they feel. But mindset does certainly play a role. It's not the end all of everything, but mindset is certainly important. And it's just kind of tackling that one day at a time. And more important than anything, just reaching out for help when we need it.
Absolutely. That's a great one. We can't underestimate, I think, the importance of getting experts involved in our lives
So
for, that counseling or that connecting that we need with our physicians or doctors, and keeping our mind, our physical health and our mental health and well-being front and center when it comes to it. If folks want to pick up a book of yours, can you remind us of the titles?
yeah, the first one is The Power of the Mind, How I Beat OCD. The second one is called The Solution. Third one is called Calm Your Mind, Transform Your Life. And I release videos on my YouTube channel, just Jeremy Bennett, and website, jeremybennett.ca.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for being with us today. I greatly appreciate all of your insights and all of your support and help for folks.
Pleasure is all mine. It was really, really good to sit down with you, Stephanie. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jeremy.